Hello and welcome to another presentation in the 10-minute tip series of programs for credit and collection professionals. This program is titled Downsizing the Credit Department. My name is Michael Dennis. I'll be your presenter today. Let's begin with an introduction. It doesn't come as a surprise to some of us. Some companies outsource the credit and collection function. They outsource it entirely or they outsource some aspect of the credit and collection function. They do so based on an assumption. The assumption is that the third-party service provider they've hired will do the job better. In this context, better means probably the outsourcing service provider will do it faster, more effectively, more efficiently, and or cheaper. The companies that do this, for whatever reason, consider credit and collection to be a non-core function. Having said that, most companies do not outsource the credit and collection activities in their entirety. They outsource parts of it. They, generally speaking, keep that portion of the credit function that deals with decision making, and specifically decisions relating to approving credit limits and negotiating payment terms. So what typically goes to a third-party service provider, what is typically outsourced, are things like debt collection and dispute resolution. As a consultant, what I've seen when I've been invited to come to businesses that have outsourced and downsized accordingly is that downsizing associated with outsourcing often leaves fairly significant gaps. Generally speaking, people in credit and collections do double duty. They do triple duty. They wear a bunch of different hats. And what I'm not suggesting is that if there is a gap, someone cannot possibly fill it. For example, let's assume that you've outsourced the collection function, and one of the side jobs that the collection function took care of was they processed credit applications, or they posted cash, or they approved credit memos, or they mailed dunning notices. Fine. Let's assume that someone could be taught how to do that, and I wouldn't argue that that is likely the case. The problem is that often what happens is outsourcing occurs, downsizing occurs concurrently, and then you see the gaps, you see the things that are missing, and those gaps and that problem affects the overall effectiveness of the credit department. From my perspective, any concerns that you might have about outsourcing are well-founded, and we're going to talk about some of those throughout the program. So let's begin with a note of caution. What companies often don't do that I believe they should do far more often and far more diligently is they should attempt to measure the risk of outsourcing. Often what happens is they spend a lot of time talking about how they are going to measure the performance of the service provider, and the service provider, of course, is happy to talk with companies about how their performance will be measured. And this is not about what measurements, and I would be the first to agree that there needs to be KPIs for the service provider to whom certain tasks are being outsourced. That's not the issue. That's obvious, that's apparent, that's necessary, that's realistic. Of course, you're going to measure the performance of the service provider once you've outsourced, and I'll just make it up, once you've outsourced collections. You're going to measure their effectiveness, sure. The question I'm asking is not that question. The question is, how are we going to measure before outsourcing the risk of outsourcing? What happens, though, is many companies do it exactly the opposite. They reduce staff first, and then they try to figure out what's missing, and they try to measure and monitor the activities of the third-party service provider, and if they are substandard or inadequate, then they're in a very difficult position. They can't very well take the tasks back because they've fired the staff that they've laid off, I should say, the staff that used to perform the work. In my experience, many companies that have outsourced credit and collection related activities underestimate the amount of work that is actually being done, and they underestimate the cost of the outsourced services. Basically, the outsourcing service providers do a tremendously good job of at least initially, of explaining how much time, energy, effort, and money you're going to save if you'll just give us this work. And then what happens, of course, is that there are ways, contractually and otherwise, that these outsourcing service providers are able to increase the fees based on services that you and they had not contemplated when the work was initially outsourced. In my experience, creditor companies also overestimate the effectiveness of the service provider. And I'm not suggesting that these third-party service providers are not competent. They are. They do a very good job, but at the absolute minimum, they need a ramp-up time. They need to understand your processes and your customers and anything peculiar with your industry or your business and your business model. And they are not, at least initially, going to be as capable and competent as the people that you formerly employed to perform these activities. One of the questions I'm often asked, at least face-to-face, is how do we avoid outsourcing? My company's thinking about outsourcing. What should I do? Well, my answer is we should all be thinking about how to increase the visibility of the activities that are performed in the credit department. And a couple of ways I would suggest you do that is to be certain that management knows what you accomplish. I think all too often management measures things like, I don't know, DSO and bad debt write-offs, and basically it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. That's what the credit department does. It manages DSO and bad debt write-offs to less than, I don't know, 0.5% of sales. They meet their targets for DSO, and that's part of what we do. But there's other aspects. We are a customer service function. Customers complain to us about we didn't get that product, or the shipment was wrong, the pricing was wrong. We're responsible for that. We interface with the salespeople. We explain issues and concerns that we have about applicants and customers and higher credit limits. We are, almost certainly, the department that has the most frequent interactions with customers, with the exception of the salesperson. I think it's important to toot your own horn. When something is accomplished, when you exceed a KPI, when you beat a goal or target that's been established for you, or even when you meet a goal or target that's been established, I think there's nothing wrong with tooting your own horn when you accomplish something, when you achieve something. Importantly, you need to look for ways to quantify the monetary value of the work that you do. If, for example, and a very easy one is bad debt write-offs. If the bad debt write-off target for this year is $1 million and the actual bad debts for this year are worth $300,000, that's pretty easy to monetize. Vis-a-vis the target, $1 million, we wrote off $300,000. So the monetary value of the work that we did to manage credit risk is $700,000. If you can't beat them, if your company is hell-bent on outsourcing, if you cannot avoid it, then I would encourage you to do this. Become an active participant in the outsourcing process. If you can't beat them, join them. The goal, I think, rationally and reasonably, is to retain core functions such as approving credit limits. There are other core functions that I think are ancillary to approving credit limits, but let's just start with you need to do everything that's associated with approving credit limits, higher credit limits for active customers, credit limits for credit applicants. If you're an active participant, you also get to suggest the functions that can and should be outsourced. Maybe they want to outsource everything but the credit limit decision making. Maybe you want to limit outsourcing to disputes and deductions. Well, I hope you found this program to be interesting and helpful. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.